Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As many of my listeners know, one of the big pushes in 21st century learning and education, and let's face it, we're well into the 21st century now, is to really get our students to be sharing their voices, to really empower our students to own their own learning journey. And one way that teachers have traditionally gotten students to at least start sharing their voices is through the personal narrative. We could have our students speaking, we could have our students presenting, we could have our students writing. There are many ways that we could actually get our students sharing their voice. Very quick personal narrative. Let me tell you a story about me. Let me tell you how I see myself. And that's clearly a form of personal narrative and a powerful one. But it's not the only way that we can be using personal narrative to really get students not only sharing their voice, but having the reader add and contemplate what the writer is saying and actually get discussions going amongst our students. So with that in mind, I'm really excited to have my next two guests on the show tonight. They are Kourtney Hake and Paige Timmerman. Kourtney is an 8th grade teacher in Illinois, and Paige is a high school English teacher in Illinois. So excited to have them on, talking about their new book, their stories, their voices, using personal narrative to empower student writers, grades 6 through 12. So Kourtney and Paige, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So one question I like to start with is why this book on personal narrative? How do you see personal narrative as empowering student writers? So we'll start with Paige and then we'll go to Kourtney.
We felt like this book was born of weaknesses in both of our instruction. We both had personal narrative units in our curriculum already, but it was an area that I know as a teacher, I was really struggling. I was having a hard time encouraging my students to talk about themselves. The stories I was getting from them were very lackluster. And so I was looking for ways to teach them really valuable writing skills and to let them know that their voice and their story is valuable. So that's where I started. I chatted with Kourtney and we came up with the idea of let's do some research and let's see what does narrative writing look like today. We started looking at a lot of different examples of how writers incorporate their own voices. And that's our jumping off point for the book.
When Paige first approached me with the idea, I really didn't teach narrative. It wasn't really a big part of my curriculum, but I knew that my 8th graders usually had to write some form of narrative on their state testing. And so they're not getting exposed to those skills, and yet we're expecting them to perform it on a standardized test. And so I was eager to figure out, okay, how can I incorporate this into the typical classroom without it being a complete overhaul of the system?
And I like how both of you have mentioned really getting students and empowering students to tell their story, but to say it and to tell it in an engaging way. So I like how both of you were talking about really giving students an opportunity to share their voices and your curiosity, the both of you, in helping students to share their voice in an engaging way. So not only helping them to prepare for state assessments, but to really engage the reader in their personal story. And as both of you had said, it's something that a lot of schools ask their students to do, tell their personal story. But again, how do we make that story engaging? What is the purpose for telling a personal narrative or writing a personal narrative? And the question I really want to ask is, how do we make it relevant for the upper grades? And that's exactly what your book is about, grades 6 through 12. Because often we talk about personal narrative, higher elementary, lower middle school. But again, there is a use for telling their story. So, how should students be sharing their story? What are the ways that we could be using personal narrative to do that? We'll start with Kourtney and then we'll go to Paige.
I think when you were talking about engagement, that is one of the most important parts of this, is that a lot of students don't really care to write an essay. However, if you're incorporating their story into the type of essay that they're writing, then they're a lot more engaged because they care about that. And so we're not asking for you to completely overhaul and redo all of your essays. It's just taking the essay formats that you already see, that analysis, that informational essay, that persuasive essay, and incorporating their student voice into that already set type of essay. And we divided that into categories in our book. We called them the informative narrative, the persuasive narrative, and the reflective narrative: informative, analytical, persuasive, and reflective. And so they were the similar types of essay that you're already teaching, but it's just incorporating that student voice into that and using information and topics that the students already care about.
Kate?
Yeah, to add to that and just echo what I was saying earlier, we really want our students, of course, we want them to do well on mandated assessments. However, I know that the most valuable thing I can do for my students is to prepare them to do the type of writing that is actually found in the real world. So that's why we read so many examples and mentor texts. We wanted to see what are real writers doing right now in their writing and how are they bringing in their own story. We noticed that real writers incorporate their voice into their writing all the time for different purposes. On the latest Taylor Swift album, a lot of times, if I'm reading that review, the writer expresses their own experience with her music. They'll explain, I've been listening to this since I was 13 years old, or I grew up with her music, or I've been a fan since whatever era. And that establishes credibility. Now, the entire review is not only about that person, but they bring themselves and they put themselves into the text. And that's something that, as I know as an ELA teacher myself, has been frowned upon in high school and middle school classrooms, that you don't use I or you don't put yourself into it. But we noticed that there's so much genre blending. There's so much of writers putting themselves in for various purposes, such as informative, doing some sort of review, analyzing something. I know I'm more engaged in the text as a reader if I feel the personality of the writer coming out. And so that's one way we really hit at that engagement that Kourtney was discussing.
There was a lot there to unpack that I agree totally with. You two might not know this, but I've been doing a little bit of writing online. And so, Paige, when you were talking about inserting yourself, now the type of writing I'm doing is on Edutopia or ASCD, talking about strategies that teachers could use. This happened to me coaching teachers the other day, and this is why I want to write an article about it. Because other than that, especially now, ChatGPT could write the article for me. But to your point about sharing a little bit of your personality, that is what still makes writing human. And that is still, at least right now, what we have over ChatGPT. And
Absolutely. And I
and
know I want to read it more if I can relate to your story about what happened in your classroom.
exactly. And it also builds that credibility, right? That, oh,
Right.
this is someone who understands the world that I'm in. To your point about what is, and we're going to get into the different types of personal narrative, But one of the ways to use a personal narrative is, again, to have others see themselves reflected in our own story, right? And to get those discussions and conversations going. The other thing I really liked about what you were both saying was that traditionally, as students ourselves, we were always told, don't put I in your writing. But perhaps social media has totally upended that, because look at the relevance of influencers now on social media.
Mhm.
They are clearly communicating a message through personal narrative and using I all the time. And that is what sells people on their message.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if Kourtney or Paige, you want to extend on that a little bit?
That was one of our inspirations for figuring out. We came up with 4 subgenres of narrative. Obviously, those are just based on patterns we've noticed. They're not the end all be all, but we've noticed these patterns in social media posts and with influencers, as you've said. And so, actually, each of our chapters about the different types of personal narrative that are in our books starts with a hypothetical social media post of things that we've seen online, using the blending of genres, using narrative to inform the audience or to analyze something or to ask a question of some sort.
Kind of set into 4 different genres within that. And we labeled them the informative narrative, the analytical narrative, the persuasive narrative, and the reflective narrative. We said they help us send a message. So, as Paige was talking about earlier, that would be sending a review or some kind of message about something that you want to inform your audience about. The one that we came up with that was most relevant was the experimental narrative, which Paige did with her freshman, and it turned out so well. They had to experiment with something. They had to learn a skill, do something new, or get better at something over a set period of time. And then they wrote about that experience. And it ended up being really cool for Paige and her students.
Paige, do you
Yeah.
want to walk us through what you found impactful about walking your students through, and what did you call it, Kourtney?
Experimental narrative.
So we were really trying to teach analytical skills in this unit. So they started with a question. It could have been, can I learn to make cookies? Or can I learn to build a tree stand? I challenged them to make or try something new that they had never tried before. It didn't have to involve money. I had one girl that she wanted to make a certain hairstyle that she had seen online, and they got a period of 3 weeks or so. Some students only did it on one day, but other students, they kept at something for every day or every other day for the whole period of time. And I asked them to take notes as they were working through trying to answer this question, trying to meet this goal. And at the end, they wrote a narrative about their experiences and what they learned and analyze how this experience went for them. And we have this example in the book. It's my favorite part of the whole book. I had a student named Ava, and she loves to draw. And so her goal was, she felt like I draw very cartoony faces. I would like my facial features that I draw to look more realistic. So you can actually see in the book the progression of what the face looked like at the beginning of the process. And then she zooms in on each body part individually on the face, and then what the face looks like at the end.
My favorite part of Ava's essay was whenever she talked about she was really struggling with the eyes, I think it was, and she kept drawing it and it wasn't turning out the way she wanted to. And instead of getting discouraged, she said that, oh, I went to watch YouTube videos and I asked my art teacher for help and I went to these different things. Because I see a lot of my students, if they don't get it the first time, they'll give up. But that project really gave them the chance to fail and really learn from their failure in a lot of ways.
Like you were saying, Kourtney, she didn't give up. She used it as an opportunity to figure out for herself where she might get more support to get better at what she wanted to get better at. So that really informs my next question. We talked about informative narrative, experimental narrative. What are the other forms? And if you can give us a quick example of those.
There's the persuasive narrative and the reflective narrative.
Sure. Yep. So by persuasive narrative, the way I viewed this was more our research essays. Every high school English teacher does a research essay, and it's usually about some sort of controversial issue. So that's not a new concept, but bringing your own voice into it is very much a new concept. And I always tell my students, like, if you want to be persuasive and you want people to care about this issue, if you have a personal connection to it, then please share it. So if you're talking about the misrepresentation of a certain racial group or gender or whatever, and you have a personal vignette that can, we don't really have that buy-in. So that's what that chapter is all about. I talk about a project called Defying Definition, which is discussing how basically you've been misunderstood and telling that story and digging into why the misunderstanding occurred and what it means and how I'm going to go forward now that this misunderstanding has happened.
Yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily persuasive, but in terms of writing with that personal connection in mind, we even see that in survivor stories. Or if we are, for example, talking about domestic violence and how to prevent domestic violence, having that message come from a writer who experienced that is going to be much more impactful than necessarily coming from a clinician who hasn't had that experience. You get different things from who is actually telling the story, if that makes any kind of sense.
The reflective narrative is what most people think of when they think of a narrative, like sharing a memoir or your own story for reflecting on something that you've experienced. And we came up with a multimedia memoir with that because we tried to come up with projects. They're reading the movies, they're reading videos, they're reading podcasts. They're looking at all kinds of different types of literacy and kind of making sure that they are prepared for our more modern literacies in the world today.
And shameless plug, earlier on in the season, we had John Arthur on. And John is former Utah Teacher of the Year who just wrote a book about digital projects. So I highlight to our listeners tonight to go back and perhaps listen in on that episode because John talks about how he's taken his students through digital projects that involve podcasting or script writing. What a wonderful way to marry personal narrative with modern literacy. That, yes, it is important that our students know how to write the traditional essay, but there are many forms of literacy today that our students do need to master if they're going to be successful for their futures. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. I want to talk a little bit about connecting this to standards. We've already talked a little bit about how there's such a vital connection between personal narrative and social and emotional learning, and particularly through the experimental personal narrative. Where do you see narrative connecting to standards in English? Those could be your state standards in Illinois, those could be the Common Core state standards.
Okay. I'll begin by saying I think that one of the most difficult standards on Common Core to meet is that rhetorical analysis. So, analyzing an author's craft. But that is something that we would start with no matter which project we're doing, no matter what type of writing we're doing, bringing in a mentor text, an example of awesome writing that I want my students to emulate this style, really looking at it and looking at how the sentences are set up, how the writer makes the argument or tells the story, and mining that text for ideas of things that they want to try in their own writing. That's something that I don't have any problems meeting that standard now. I know that doesn't fully answer your question, but I did want to make sure I mentioned that because that is a really hard standard to hit. We all want to get in there and analyze the literature, but I think sometimes it's nice to take a step back and also look at how a text is written too. It's very valuable as a reader and a writer.
Indeed. Kourtney?
Yeah, I think whenever we were trying to figure out our categories, we were also looking to the standards that what do they have to write in middle school and high school. In middle school, they don't have to write as much, obviously. They have to write an informative essay and an argument essay. And so that's what we kept an eye on as we were coming up with our categories of what kind of essays do they already have to write, and how can we incorporate narrative into those already set standards? Because the skills are the same. The skills are the same whether they're writing an informative essay or an informative essay that incorporates their voice. It's just trying to get them to marry those skills of the narratives incorporating their own voice and the informative essay, which is very possible without completely overhauling your curriculum.
Indeed. Kourtney, Paige brought up something that I want to talk with, and we'll start with you, Kourtney. She was mentioning how she has come to rely on certain anchor texts to teach students the craft of personal narrative. Who are your go-to people, Kourtney, say at the middle school level? And then I'll ask Paige who her go-to.
My problem is that I am married to my set curriculum right now. I can pull in the text here and there, but I don't really have any major authors that I absolutely can rely on. I personally love David Sedaris, and I've taken some of his articles, heavily edited sometimes, just because he's really good storyteller. And I've used some of his to share some of the things, but I don't really get to dive into text like I would like to right now.
Fair enough.
I will be honest with you. This is a question I'm afraid of just because I think any text written by a published writer it can be a mentor text. It just depends on what you're looking for your students. But I would say a resource that I find myself going back to over and over again is the New York Times. I'll tell any teacher that will listen that they need to get on the Learning Network on the New York Times because they have ready-made units on there using real articles from real journalists that are writing for the Times as mentor texts. So if I want my students to learn a certain skill, then that's usually where I'll begin. How do the journalists do this? An example of the skill that I'm looking to teach. And then I just feel like both of us, I mean, as teachers, we just read so voluminously already that like we're reading for pleasure, but then as we're reading, we're like, oh, that chapter would work really great at teaching this skill. We had already read some of them just on our own, just because we enjoy reading. And so I think it's just reading in a different way, like reading obviously for enjoyment and pleasure, but also with that ulterior motive of, can I find something in here for my students? And sometimes you don't see it right away, but then 2 years later, you're like, oh yeah, I read that book and that would work really well in this unit.
I think that's all part of it of I change everything every year. Not everything, but I do change those mentor texts a lot. And so I'm not married to anything. Yeah.
So we've been talking about a lot of really creative, interesting ways to get students to write personal narratives. And Paige, you were talking about the experimental essay project that you were doing, where a student really highlighted her transformation as an artist and drawing facial features and making them more realistic. Can you, both of you, would you mind sharing, say, two or three of your favorite personal narrative projects that you've done with your students that other teachers might be able to replicate in their own classrooms? And then we'll start with Kourtney. And Kourtney, please feel free to share any projects that would work on the middle school level. And then Paige, any that you think you would recommend for a high school English teacher.
So we did have project ideas in every chapter. We had a larger project that was part of it. And then we end each chapter with a unit plan that gives exactly, you can pick it up tomorrow and start teaching that. So if there's a specific skill that you were really wanting to teach, or you really want to do the informative narrative, you figure out, okay, my kids need to know these skills. I want them to do this kind of project. One of the things that I really liked was we presented an etiquette project or an etiquette podcast where they had to kind of research etiquette and present a podcast on a specific etiquette skill that they learned about. that kind of incorporated different types of literacy. One, they had to learn, okay, what was the etiquette then? What is the etiquette now? And then also, how do they present that in a informative and entertaining podcast form?
Kourtney was also telling us about the structure of the book, how you have a
Right.
starter activity, a main activity. Yeah.
Okay, the one I like the most is a podcast too. But anyway, I'll talk about it. So, my favorite project in the book that I've done is called the Friendship Podcast. So, it is in the chapter where we talk about the analytical narrative. So, starting with a question and exploring that question. And we've noticed that the podcast is such a great format for that because a lot of times that's just what they're doing on a podcast episode. They're just exploring. I wanted my students to be able to do that because I think in school sometimes there's this assumption that we're always looking for the right answer and we want their minds to be free to roam as well. A lot of my students haven't really listened to podcasts before. So we listened to a podcast that Kourtney introduced me to called Invisibilia, which I believe is no longer creating new episodes, but you can still find the older episodes. And each season revolved around a different topic. They had a whole season around friendship, and each episode was based around a different friendship question. So one of their episodes was what happens, like, how do you end a friendship? Do you have a conversation about it? Do you just let it go? Is it okay to ghost a friend? So these were some of the questions that were brought in. And of course, there was narrative involved because they brought in not only did the hosts share their own perspectives, but then they interviewed different people that shared stories that helped them propel the conversation and continue thinking about it. So we listened to a few of those episodes. Then I had my students create their own friendship based question. And they had to create a shorter podcast episode where they explored that question, shared their own stories, brought in somebody else's story, and continued to talk about it and see where they come up with by the end of the episode.
One of the examples she had was that the two students interviewed a librarian about gossip and whether gossip could ever be positive. And it actually turned out really well. They were thinking about all the ways that you could gossip and what it does and whether it can help them in any way, shape, or form.
And what the two of you are doing is you're convincing me that I also need to do an episode on podcasting with students because it's brilliant how you took an existing podcast as a modern exemplar and used it to help your students create their own podcast around their own narratives around that topic of friendship. So that's just brilliant.
Can't ignore the podcast anymore. It was really scary and daunting, and at that point, a lot of my students didn't even know what a podcast was. But I think as time goes on, we just can't ignore it as a vital genre anymore. I think that it has an absolute place in our classrooms, and we need to figure out a way to make it work for our students. And I know it's daunting. How do I even begin? But there's so many great examples out there that we can pull from to use as starter points and then see what our students create from there.
Couldn't agree more. So, ladies, what would be a challenge for teachers wanting their students to do more personal narrative writing? What were some of the challenges you encountered, and how did you solve those challenges? We'll start with Paige, and then we'll go to Kourtney.
I would just echo our conversation that we opened with is that engagement. I think again, narrative traditionally is answering journal prompts in the classroom. What did you do this summer? What's your favorite food? And those prompts are so stale, especially for our older students. And so I think the biggest challenge is knowing your students and knowing what is going to engage them and get that story to come alive because they all have a story to share. Whether they realize it or not, they're an expert on something. They have something to say. It's just a matter of finding that right niche to get that story out of them. And that's why we designed the book the way that we did. I know Kourtney talked about how we have menus at the beginning of each chapter. And we wanted to give our readers a plethora of choices to meet the needs of their students, no matter who they are, to give them that opportunity to be engaged.
They seem to be getting that. Okay, now they need Y skill. Now I can pull this activity and do that. And so it's not just pulling in those skills as they need it. Whenever I feel like I'm married to a curriculum, I need to take a pause and say, okay, my kids still need help with this. I need to pull that activity in to do that.
And I really like how you mentioned that, Kourtney, because I'm sure there are people listening who are in schools with more of a prescriptive curriculum who were probably listening to this episode going, these project ideas, they're great. I wish I could do them, but I can't. But you just highlighted that it would be great if students could develop that digital media literacy. But if the teacher is constricted, that doesn't mean you can't bring in student voice, because we do want to engage our students in learning. And let's face it, whether they're middle school or high school, they're adolescents, and it's all about them, as it was for us when we were that age. So I like how you're saying you could bring in bits and pieces to augment and enrich your curriculum and the skills that the kids would need to know anyway. So I have two questions before we talk about where people can find you. Do you specifically and strategically tie student discussion to student personal narrative writing? How have you done that in your classes? We'll start with Kourtney and then we'll go to Paige.
I usually, at the middle school level, I keep those separate because they are still struggling to learn how to discuss really in that academic format. So it's a lot more training, I would say, at the middle school level of what does a discussion look like,
Mhm.
but we don't do a lot of discussion while we're writing as a whole class.
Paige?
Oh, we're discussing all the time. I do have honors level seniors. They're wonderful. And I have them in pods. So I feel like the better a teacher I am, because the less work it looks like I'm doing, because I'm having them talk to each other a lot as they're working through their process. I like to start with a full class discussion about the topic we're going to be exploring to get us all together. After that, I want my students chatting. I want them reflecting throughout the process. Hey, I'm thinking about trying this in my draft. What do you think? How might this work? How might I incorporate that? I like to have them talk aloud and mentally sort through what they're planning on doing with somebody else.
I often joke with the teachers that I coach. I say, what I'm about to tell you, I don't really believe, but a narrative purpose. I often say, I want teachers being tired coming into school because they've been up all night planning a great lesson. Like I said, I'm not really expecting teachers to be up all night planning a lesson, but they're taking the time finding those anchor texts. They're taking the time to find those resources that then can engage students in their own personal narrative writing. So you're not lazy. Students, to Kourtney's point, do need skill development, not only in the writing, but in the discussing as well. I tell teachers at the end of the day, I want kids going home tired. So I want teachers coming in tired from planning and kids going home tired from thinking and doing.
No, and I always take that as a compliment. If I want my students working harder than me, they don't see the work that I put into a lesson, but I'm not going to work harder on that narrative than they are.
My follow-up question is this: as writing teachers, how do you feel about AI and having students write their personal narratives, using AI as a tool, not using AI as a tool? What are your thoughts on this? And who wants to go first?
So I think both of us are on the same page in that it's not going to go away. It's part of our world now. And we're doing our students a disservice if we don't acknowledge that it exists and that it actually is helpful in some ways. So I do think it's a really valuable tool in getting some structure. So my students, they just wrote a 2,000 word essay. It's a dual credit class. And it was so helpful for them to go to Chat GPT and say, hey, can you help me make an outline on climate change? Can you help me come up with a structure? And it did such a great job of laying out some different sections for them that they may not have thought of. I used to have students do the research and then make their outline, but I actually flipped it because it gave them ideas of things that they might want to go in and research. So they still did all the work themselves, but I had them start with an outline just to give them some ideas of some different points, get everything organized, and then I think the essays were much more clear after that.
Then we have to think about how you're designing the assignment. If your students can quote unquote cheat and do the assignment without, to your point, Paige, doing any thinking, then it's not something wrong with the kids. There's something wrong with the design of that assessment or that product.
Right.
You use it as a tool to help students clarify their thinking, and then they go and find the research to augment that thinking.
And then we talked about different examples, but then I brought in AI. Is it ethical to use this? And what is an ethical use of AI and what's not an ethical use of AI? Rather than me just saying you can't use it or it's a 0, I wanted them to really think through, okay, in what ways is it being used as a support? And in what ways is it replacing my thinking?
I've had that conversation with my students as well. I had one kid, he turned in an essay that was obviously AI. And I told him, you got to do it again. And he did it again, but all he did is told ChatGPT, write it at an 8th grade level. I still knew it was his voice. And I was
I
like,
don't realize how obvious it is.
I told him, I was like, this isn't you. Like, you didn't write this sentence. And he's like, how do you know? And I'm like, because I know you. Like, yeah, you dumbed it down. You told ChatGPT to dumb it down, but that's still not your voice.
So, ladies, we've talked about a lot today. What have we not talked about in terms of writing, personal narratives, getting students to share their voice in writing? What else do you want the listeners to know?
I think I just want to reiterate that engagement is so easy whenever they're writing about themselves or about things that they care about and things that they want to know more about. By incorporating narrative into your already established writing styles, students are going to be way more engaged in the topic and they're actually going to want to write.
We have so much going on, but I just think we're doing our students a huge disservice if we don't give them those opportunities. We're not preparing them for the actual real world writing that they will encounter and likely do themselves if we don't allow them to bring their voice into it. And their voices do matter and they do have stories to share.
Exactly. So now, ladies, where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing? We'll start with Paige and then we'll go to Kourtney.
Okay, so, well, you can find our book, Their Stories, Their Voices, on Amazon and at Solution Tree. I am on Twitter or X at Timmerman Page, and I also answer emails timmermanp@salemhigh.com.
I am on Twitter and Blue Sky at What the Hake, rhymes with cake, What the Hake. You can also email me at hake.courtney@gmail.com.
Ladies, thank you both for a very interesting conversation. It's really both. It's writing and thinking and discussing projects with students. So thank you for doing the hard fight and helping our students to share their stories, because stories do matter. So thank you both for your time tonight. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.